So I am in constant pursuit for an understanding of what principles and conditions have to be in place or present for a true revolution to occur. This leads me to Frank Chapman's book, Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism, which was published in 2021. Deep into his analysis, chapter 8 to be exact, Chapman discusses the rise of fascism and its relation to capitalism, and on the other end, the Black struggle. And as he's inquiring into American exceptionalism and fascism, he references William Z. Foster's explanation of why, at the time after World War I, when many governments like Germany were trending toward and choosing fascism, the quote, U.S. monopoly capitalists didn't choose fascism. One, U.S. capitalism wasn't as deeply affected by the general crisis of the system as was Germany. Two, U.S. capitalism didn't have an army of workers moving toward an imminent revolution, as was the case in Germany. Three, the imperialist powers that controlled U.S. capitalism were fine with the status quo, and there wasn't a party ready for a world war to redivide the world like Germany. And four, in the U.S., there was still the financial means to carry out reform programs like FDR's The New Deal, staving off a full turn toward fascism. That last point is important because Chapman goes on to explain how the New Deal was used to control the revolutionary masses. The monopoly capitalist bosses were using the Reformation plan to hide their control of unionism and organized labor. The New Deal, beginning in 1933, still allowed for 13 million people to be unemployed in 1936. This led to a large strike movement, what the powers that be ultimately hoped to avoid. But through this movement, labor won concessions, such as the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, the Wagner Act, which created the National Labor Relations Board, and the Social Security Act. Unemployment went down, profits ultimately went up, and the struggle between the classes seemed to chill. But for Black people, unemployment remained steady at 50%. It seems that the New Deal could not overcome racist practices. Today, in my state of Texas, we're witnessing in real time a complete turn toward fascism. Our institutions, from the governor's office all the way down to our local school boards, are making ever increasingly reactionary decisions. And in this specific podcast, we want to take a look at Texas local school boards and the State Board of Education as a microcosm of that shift toward fascism. So with that, let me introduce Maggie Stern. Maggie Stern is the Youth Civic Education and Engagement Coordinator with the Children's Defense Fund of Texas, leading statewide advocacy work to increase youth civic power and running CDF's youth advocacy program, YOUthTX. Maggie holds a master's in public affairs from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and an undergraduate degree from Boston College. Outside of work, Maggie enjoys biking, reading, and discovering new music. Thanks for joining me, Maggie.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here so much. I'm excited about this conversation. So can you tell us a little how you became so involved in youth advocacy and analyzing the Texas legislature?
Sure, yeah. So I actually did not grow up in Texas. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a very politically we talked about politics all the time in my family. So I was pretty used to sitting around the dinner table with all my cousins, hearing adults talk about what was going on in politics. And I, older sister, oldest cousin, I've always been around children and young people. I worked at a daycare to get through college, and I nannied part-time through grad school. So I've always worked with kids. And so when I was when I moved to Texas, it was for my graduate school at UT. And I was really interested in public affairs as a combination of the advocacy work that I'd been doing in undergrad and just wanting to look at look at how things worked on a more structural level. And I'd never stepped foot in Texas before, but I moved to Austin and started interning with Children's Defense Fund as part of the requirement for graduate school, and just met so many amazing Texas organizers and advocates who are doing amazing work on any number of issues. And and had the chance to learn like really from the ground up what Texas policy looks like, what it means to organize in a state like Texas that is so big, so diverse, for so many years has been so politically suppressed by people in power and big money. And, you know, I really wanted to like, and also knowing how young Texas is as a state, I've been able to bring kind of my experience working with young people and my love for working with young people who are just like so aware of the issues that they are facing, and wanting to speak up and make a difference on those issues. That, you know, I've been able to bring kind of the youth advocacy piece into my work so that young Texans are really leading the policy discussions that we're having. So it's been kind of a winding path to get here, but it's been really incredible.
For sure. And I know firsthand the work that you do. So I'll just tell you off the bat that I appreciate it. So, and in this specific, oh yeah, no worries. And in this specific episode, we do want to focus on State Board of Education, local school boards. So can you start off by telling us what is the State Board of Education here in Texas? What do they do and why is it so important? And how does it affect not just the students' education, but our population in general?
Yeah, so the State Board of Education is one of those things that like I didn't know about until I started working in this space. They don't get the same amount of like play on media or the public conversation as like the governor, but they're really important, and, you know, dictate a lot of how Texas students are experiencing their day-to-day lives. So the State Board of Education is part of the Texas Education Agency. It's an elected body of 15 representatives that set like policies and standards for Texas public schools, which includes charter schools. So they do a lot of different things. They like establish graduation requirements. They oversee the permanent school fund. They approve applications for charter schools. But the work that we do with them primarily is that they are the body that is responsible for setting curriculum standards, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, or TEKS. And then they adopt like textbooks and things that schools can use that fulfill those requirements. So at the moment, they're rewriting the social studies curriculum, and talking a lot about, you know, how do we talk about, like, are we teaching students an honest and accurate history about everything that has happened in Texas and in this country? No, most of the time not. But how do we talk about like race, racism, discrimination, gender, throughout history, and also as students are like forming their identity as people who participate in their communities today. So the State Board is really responsible for setting a lot of the like standards for how students are going to have those conversations. They are elected officials, so they get, again, there's 15 of them. They get elected by district for 4-year terms. Right now there is 9 Republicans and 6 Democrats, but they're all up for re-election this November. And there are some folks running who are very far right. So for as much as they've been, you know, on the hot seat in the past for like not wanting to teach about evolution or calling Moses one of the founding fathers, things can get much worse come January, depending on how some of those November races go.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So, wow. Well, concerning our Texas legislature directly, can you talk about the ways and tactics they're using to implement their ideas into the education system?
Yes. Yeah, so the legislature has been, particularly this last session, like doing a lot more around trying to dictate how curriculum is set. Again, like that is technically the State Board of Education's job, but the legislature passed some bills last session, very similar to bills that have been passed around the country, that typically get referred to as like anti-critical race theory bills, but are really, you know, censorship bills, like preventing teachers and students from talking about like the history of white supremacy in this country. And so, you know, they've been passing legislation like that. There's also a piece of that bill. It was originally House Bill 3979, and then they cleaned it up and passed it again as Senate Bill 3. There's also a piece of that makes it so students can't get school credit for any sort of advocacy. So like if they interned with the Children's Defense Fund, for example, like we are nonprofit, nonpartisan, but they couldn't get school service credit or anything for choosing to do any sort of advocacy work. So that's another piece of that bill. There's also things on the table for next session that Dan Patrick, who's the lieutenant governor, head of the Texas Senate, has said will be priorities for him next session, like stripping tenure from university professors. So, it makes it much easier for, it would really take away like professors' academic freedom to be able to say like, you don't have any employment protections, essentially, if you say something that the state disagrees with. And certainly Texas has a history of firing professors for speaking out against the state and state policies. The Lieutenant Governor Patrick has also said he wants to pass a version of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. Yes, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially saying that like you can't talk about sexual orientation or gender identity in the classroom, which, is really targeting like LGBTQ plus students, but also is ridiculous because everyone has a sexual orientation and gender identity, and not to be able to talk about parts of students' identities is really, really damaging to them, to their families, to teachers in the classroom who come into the classroom as full people too. So that's certainly on the table, and all these things kind of get tied together, like bans on talking about sexual orientation, bans on talking about race, like it all gets bundled into one thing. So that's kind of they pass bills to do that. They've also, behind the scenes, kind of like threatened some funding things. So like public universities that get money from the state, obviously, to operate, have to be really careful about talking about some of these issues in case their funding is at risk next session. And then we've also seen state lawmakers, create these lists of books that they're concerned about in the classroom, and sent it out to school districts to investigate if those books are in the classroom. And again, books about like Black people existing in history, about LGBTQ plus issues, books about like the abortion debate, anything really about these topics that the far right doesn't want to talk about or acknowledge exist. There's been a real push to like ban those books and conversations from the classroom. So there's a few different like angles. But definitely as we get into the next session, next January, we will probably see a lot more of those sorts of bills attacking both K-12 schools, but also like colleges and universities.